Ukraine destroys 90% of every heavy equipment the Russians send towards the front line in a specific area. That is what a Russian mill blogger is admitting, while at the same time the Ukrainians have almost reached Novoprokopivka, south of Orikhiv again. But even though those are great news, we also have the overall trend that is not that much in Ukraine's favor as of this moment. But we'll talk about this in the situation report. We'll start off with the overall situation. Ukraine has struck a railroad bridge that was under construction at Ranite. This is here. This was meant to connect the railroad line here with the railroads up here to connect the land bridge in the south with mainland Russia outside of the Crimean Bridge. The bridge that was under construction is at least heavily damaged. I'm not sure if it is destroyed. This seems to be unlikely, but it's rendered unusable, and obviously works on it will be under permanent threat of attack as of now. At the same time, Russia, for instance, has used on the 7th to the 8th of January 59 rocket missiles and drones against Ukraine. Ukraine is saying that while they shoot down 70% of everything that's being fired at them, at the same time they are urgently needing more SAM systems, more air defense systems to fight ballistic missiles, as ballistic missiles can only be intercepted with a fraction of their systems. At the same time, also the Russian Kh-22 are so far undefensible. The Ukrainians have not found anything to shoot them down successfully with. This is an old anti-ship guided missile, a cruise missile against ship that is reaching very high altitude, above the altitude of several medium-range systems, to then dive down on the intended target. Its accuracy supposedly is fairly small, especially when attacking land targets, but it flies with a speed of up to 4.6 Mach. And at the same time, at times over 20,000 meters, so hard to intercept. And as of now, Ukraine has not managed to shoot down a single one of them. At the same time, the spokesperson of the Ukrainian Air Force said they have to now ration their SAM systems, their missiles, as they are running short on it again, obviously due to the waves of attacks on Ukraine over the last 2 weeks. At the same time, there are reports of explosions in Kharkiv as well as in Belgorod, so both sides strike each other here in this area, and both sides react to that. In Belgorod, they are now starting to evacuate children. A first lot of 100 children is getting evacuated, according to the Russians, while Ukraine is starting to build an underground school in Kharkiv, showing how long-term they have to think, that they expect the shelling of the city to continue over a very long time to make it worthwhile constructing an underground school. Also, US representatives met with companies to talk about the additional production for air defense system. There are reports of this coming now, were published by Reuters. At the same time, the obvious question would be, why now? Why wasn't this done months or even years ago? If we go to the front line, we have the usual reports fighting in the north. The main focus is in the direction of Kupiansk, where the Russians want to take that transportation hub. Sinkivka is getting attacked again and again, and in most of those attacks, a lot of them are captured by video. The Russians still lose numerous heavy equipment. A fresh attack showed the destruction of 2 MBTs and 3 IFVs through mines and artillery and anti-tank guided missiles, as well as the complete destruction of the infantry group of the soldiers afterwards. So the Russians keep suffering heavy losses. I cannot confirm any change in territory in this area. The fighting is obviously also continuing along the other parts of the front line, but I cannot confirm any change in territory. So we'll go right down south of the Siversky Donetsk. At Spirne, fighting is also continuing. No change in territory here. When it comes to Bodanivka, the Russians claim that they have advanced into the town further, that they're having success here, that that they have taken the majority of the town. I do not see any proof of this as of now, so this might not be true. I have no idea whether it's true or not. We'll observe it in the coming situation reports. Further south, no change that I can confirm, neither at Klishivka nor at Andrivka, so we switch directly to the Avdiivka pocket. Here, the Ukrainians claim that they managed to push out the Russians, as we can see it here. This is a pro-Ukrainian mill blogger who says that they pushed out the Russians completely from Stepove. The Russians are now at the outskirts here, more or less here in a little bit in the east-west forest lines. While I have seen visual evidence of Russians being attacked in these positions, I cannot confirm that there is no more Russian presence in this area, which would be indicated by this here. So this is somewhat dubious, and as you know, especially if you're a recurring viewer, then you know that claims of success are taken less serious from my side than admittance of defeat. And I have not seen a Russian side that is serious confirming that they lost Stepove, whereas the Ukrainians claim they take it. I'll do it in both ways. So when the Russians claim a success, it doesn't matter that much unless the Ukrainians confirm that they've lost this position. And here we only have the Ukrainians claiming success. So unclear as of now. Further south, though, we have a Ukrainian admittance of defeat. Here at Pervomaiske, the fighting is continuing and the Russians managed to push somewhat further here in this direction. Again, we have Petrenko also admitting that they lost a small section in the area and were pushed further east. Further south at Marinka, the Russians advanced slowly forward. Moment, Marinka is here. They have advanced somewhat in this area here. Slowly, they are getting into the next town of Herohivka. Here, Herohivka. I'm sorry. I try to halfway pronounce it without swallowing whole syllables. So this unfortunately leads to this now and then. So here we have the Russians advancing further. We have geolocalizations here that they have entered the first houses of that town here in two positions in this direction. They also entered it north of the lakes here, but this was already done a couple of days ago. So slow grinding advance in this area as well. Further south at Vuhledar, the Ukrainians have thrown in the direction of Vuhledar. At Novomikhailivka, the Ukrainians have managed to throw the Russians away from the town in this area here. This is even admitted by Russian mill bloggers who said it's too early for the Ukrainian armed forces to talk about stabilizing the LBS, so the front line in this area, but they have achieved tactical success. This is one of the Russian big mill bloggers admitting that they were thrown back here. At the same time, the Russians managed to creep somewhat north in the tree line here, and they managed to more or less capture that whole area. So while they were thrown out of Novomikhailivka, they are advancing further west to it and increasing the pressure in the south overall on the town itself. On the oblast border, so while there might be fighting here as well, nothing of it was noteworthy. On the border between the oblasts of Donetsk and Zaporizhzhia, we have fresh attacks by the Russians in the direction of Staromayorsk, but not even the Russians claim that they were successful. This is somewhat remarkable, as this front line has been mostly quiet over the past few weeks, so that we have the reports of Russian attacks towards Staromayorsk is an exception in regards to the last few weeks. South of Orikhiv, we have changes as well. A big Russian mill blogger is saying that the Ukrainians retook positions in the direction of Novoprokopivka, and he says the front line almost came into inhabited areas. It came very close to it, so it should be more or less in this area. So they basically almost entered the town, but not the town itself, which would indicate smaller advances here. But at the same time, the Russians had minor successes in this area here, pushing the Ukrainians a little bit back. So overall, really small tactical changes, but no overall change whatsoever. And when we go to the area on the Dnipro, at Krinky, we have repeated attacks by the Russians, intensive attacks on Krinky. including with armored vehicles. We have a report here by Riba. This is one of the big Russian mill bloggers that is talking about what's going well and what's going bad. He says they say there's less meat attacks, less attritional attacks in this area since Teplinsky took over. Colonel General Teplinsky from the VDV took over roughly 2 months ago. At the same time, there are still massive problems here. For instance, Ukrainian Air Force is operating at will, as the local units apparently do not have permission to engage on their own accord, likely because the Supreme Command expects it more likely that Russian planes are in the area than Ukrainians, and this would then reduce the risk of friendly fire. But at least in this regard, they are complaining that the Ukrainians just fly in, they hover above Krinky, they bring in reinforcements now and then, they bring in resupply, and the air defense, even if when they are able to spot them, are not allowed to engage. At the same time, also when they have to use artillery, it takes hours before the permission to fire is given, which obviously allows the Ukrainians to move whatever was originally there, and thus reducing the effectiveness of the artillery. At the same time, they are also saying that electronic warfare is still a problem in the region. This was one of the regions where the Russians routinely complained that Ukrainian electronic warfare is actually superior. Usually in other reports, for instance, from General Salushny himself, he said that the Russians are superior in electronic warfare. And we have another mill blogger saying here that the Ukrainians destroy 90% of the equipment that is moved close to Krinky because of their dominance in drones there. He's complaining that the people are too stupid to realize it, that they move the equipment by day and thus suffering heavy losses here. This is an admittance of how effective the Ukrainian drones are here, and probably a good explanation why the Ukrainians are still inside of Krinky despite facing at least 8 brigades along the Dnipro front line, while only having a few hundred men. By any normal circumstances, they should be wiped out long by now, but as we can see, they are still managed to stay inside of the town despite continuous Russian attacks. Overall, to the general situation, we have some dire news when it comes to artillery shells. According to latest reports, Ukraine, during its counteroffensive, was using 7,000 grenades a day, artillery shells a day, against 5,000 Russians. So they had actual superiority in firepower and in ammunition. Now the respective numbers are 2,000 and 10,000, meaning the Ukrainians are only able to shoot 2,000 shells a day against 10,000 Russians. Obviously, the fresh supply from North Korea is already being visible along the front lines here. And the Ukrainian Resistance Center is saying that 450,000 Russian soldiers are inside of the Ukraine. Vladimir Putin in December said that it's 617,000 in the combat zone, so it's not quite clear while there's some discrepancy, and 450,000 would not necessarily allow for the numerical superiority that the Ukrainians regularly complain about in specific areas. So it might be that they are counting it differently. Either Putin included irregular formations and somewhat back areas, or it's unclear where the discrepancy seems, but it seems that the actual number is probably higher than 450,000, at least if we look at the reports that are coming from the front line. And in Orel, a drone has hit an oil storage facility. The one tank was destroyed. Obviously, it must have been a Ukrainian drone, even though I do not have confirmation about the type. So theoretically, it could be a locally started drone by some resistance fighter, even though it's more likely it came from Ukraine. In the partisan area, we have some interesting news as well. This is, let me see, should be this here. Yep. The report is from a Ukrainian side. Obviously, we have to take it with that context. But according to that, 2 women, 2 girls, they call it here. I'm not sure if this is slang or this is meaning 2 actual girls, like 12-year-olds, or if it's more or less young women. So I'm just sticking with women. 2 women eliminated several dozen. In total, they are talking about 46 soldiers were poisoned and apparently died from that. And when they were supposed to be arrested, they opened fire on the FSB and managed to kill another 3 FSB officers before managing to evade the Russians and manage to disappear. Now, if this story isn't a propaganda piece, which is possible as it's from a Ukrainian source here talking about Ukrainian successes, we have to have some skepticism in total here. If this is true, it would indicate a few interesting parts. First of all, it shows a big problem that is usually facing men, that they don't take women seriously enough. According to them, the FSB men didn't expect heavy fighting resistance from the women when they were coming to arrest them, which allowed the Ukrainian women to kill 3 of them and wound several others and manage to escape. This is obvious if you expect women to be frail and not dangerous, then you approach them differently than when you expect men that are fighting back. So this could have been the downfall of those 3 FSB officers. And at the same time, if they manage to kill 3 by shooting, if they get the poison and successfully poison almost 50 men, this is more of an indication that they were well trained. So either it's probably my suspicion, my expectation would be that they are trained by the SBU, and we see active and encouraged and trained resistance in the areas occupied by Russia by the Ukrainians once more in this regard, and supposedly almost 50 Russians taken out in this context. The Russian Ministry of Defense is trying to show its successes in treating military families well. This is obviously needed from the Russian side, as after that one wave of partial mobilization, they try to keep up their numbers with voluntary recruitment, and for that they have to offer financial benefit. So now the Ministry of Defense is saying that they supplied 56,000 military families with houses and improved their living situation, and 100,000 were reimbursed of their rent. So financially reimbursed. We also have the Russian expert Lebedev, who talked about the KN-23. This is the Russian ballistic missile that the North Korean ballistic missile that the Russians use. It's funny that he calls them Kim-Skander, like Iskander, but with Kim in the front, because they are so close. He says they have inertial navigation with the option of additional satellite navigation, and a gas jet rudder allows them to actually take evasive maneuvers, making it more difficult to intercept them. Russia has also started using Shahed 238 drones. Those are called by the Russians Geran 3. They have a jet engine, and supposedly are 500 kilometers an hour fast and carry a warhead of 300 kilograms. At least that's what the Russians tell us. So I don't have the full information whether this is somewhere close to reality, but obviously with jet power it should be faster. In comparison, the Shahed 136 is only 200 kilometers an hour fast and only carries 50 kilograms, so 6 times the explosive mass on board of the Shahed 238 in this regard. They are shorter range though and more expensive, and we have the claims here by COTS News here in this regard. So basically by forwarded from another one. Those are one of the bigger pro-Russian mill bloggers claiming those numbers. As said, no way of confirming it as of now if those numbers are true, because 300 kilograms would be a fairly impressive warhead actually for something like this. But the Russians are also starting a new production of a new glide bomb. This is the Drel. They have a cluster warhead and are glide bombs, and are meant to attack armored vehicles, air defense batteries, also the guidance, the control elements of power plants, and thus should be a serious problem for the Ukrainians if the numbers are true and if they actually enter serial production fairly soon, as the Russians claim. We have a picture of those bombs here. So this is how they are supposed to be. Somewhat surprising to me is that they don't have bigger wings. This seems more like a guided bomb, not necessarily that much like a gliding bomb. So the range should be shorter. At least That would be my expectation, unless those wings can somewhat fold out and increase the lift and thus increase the range. In the political sphere, we have some information. Putin has now decreed that in Russia, Ukrainian children can now be given the Russian citizenship even without the permission from the parents. This is obviously meant to allow making Ukrainian children Russians, and the Ukrainians are saying this is done against the will of the parents and the children to basically make abducted children Russian citizens. The Ukrainians are saying basically since the beginning of the war that the Russians are deporting hundreds of thousands of children into Russia, whereas the Russians claim no, this is for medical reasons, to allow them to relax outside of the war zone, etc. Depending on which side you want to believe, you could take one or the other side more serious, but we do know for a fact that some of the children wanted to come back to Ukraine and had to be exchanged. They needed external help to be allowed back because the Russians initially didn't want them to leave. Ukraine is also saying that they are missing 25,000 civilians in the Russian occupied areas. At least 763 were confirmed to be in Russian prisons in November by the Red Cross. But obviously the Red Cross does not have access to every area. And the Ukrainians saying that Russia has incarcerated thousands of civilians in penal colonies and in jails without any prosecution, without any sentence, without anything legally going on. This might be to simply basically an internment of civilians, which should not be legal as far as I know. So that should be a war crime, at least if I'm not mistaken in this regard. We have poll numbers. The Russians are now the majority. The number of Russians that want a withdrawal from Ukraine, even without achieving the war aims, is now higher than the supporters of the ongoing war. But at the same time, the Russians still trust Vladimir Putin to do this. So it's not like they want to exchange the government. They just say Putin should rather withdraw without achieving the war aims. So a massive political shift is at least not expected yet. We also have numbers from other polls. His foreign policy is still trusted by 67%. 58% approve of his domestic policies, and we have and 66%, so a full 2/3, want to vote for Putin in the coming presidential election. It's also interesting that the propaganda of Russia is successful, as 64% see this war as a defensive war against NATO, not an aggressive war against a neighboring country, and 63% support the special military operation, so the Ukraine invasion by Russia. 63%, that's basically 2/3 in this regard. But the population increasingly feels restrictions and is getting more unhappy about this. So while we see some movement away from supporting the war overall, some discontent, at least if those numbers, and they are considered to be independent, if those numbers aren't lying, we are far away from a collapse of the Russian system, of a deposing of Putin because of opposition to the war. And we have numbers now from the Ukrainian side as well to compare that. And according to this, 96% are still supporting the military, 88% Zaluzhny, the supreme commander. So those are amazing numbers, but Zelensky only has 66% approval rating as of now. A year ago, it was still at 88%. Now, this is still a full 2/3, and we can expect that during a wartime, the internal conflicts make those numbers less good, but it's still interesting as we had Zaluzhny basically giving a sober assessment of the counteroffensive, whereas we had Zelensky trying to encourage his population over the past year and a half that they will be really successful with the counteroffensives, and now obviously he's suffering from not fulfilling these expectations. But again, even from the Ukrainian side as well, we do not see any sign of collapse on their side. 88% supporting Zaluzhny, 96% trusting the military is far from an expected collapse on the Ukrainian side. In Riyadh, there was a meeting of supporters of Ukraine. At least this is how it would be understood. The G7 met together with India, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Ukraine, and other nations to talk about the support of a Ukrainian position in peace negotiations. So I guess there is some backwater talking what Ukraine would be willing to give in exchange for what. We'll have to see, but it's nowhere close that a peace agreement would be possible, especially as Russia is convinced that they are winning the war. Brazil, China, and the United Arab Emirates did not join in. And when it comes to the international support, the Danish F-16s are coming 6 months later than expected. The reasons for that are supposedly training of mechanics, but that's not really confirmed in detail. The Ukrainian Ministry of Defense said they have just introduced another 15 weapon systems, among them robots, drones, electronic warfare, engineering equipment, modernized IFVs, ATGMs, and ammunition. So the Ukrainians try to produce as much as they can. They produced, for instance, the BTR-3 and BTR-4 in the past, so I guess new versions of those, taking account of the experience from this war, were now introduced. And they say that 2023 they introduced more than 200 weapon systems to their armed forces, but obviously the number of systems is not necessarily a sign of strength. It's the number of items in total that matter, and 200 systems theoretically also mean 200 different manuals, 200 different trainings, etc. So whether this is a sign of strength or not is up for debate. Still, though, we see the Ukrainians trying their best to produce as much as they can while the West wavers in their support. The Ukrainian defense minister also said that they ordered 50,000 uniforms for women. In October, so uniforms specially designed for women to take into account that their bodies are different than men's. And in October, the numbers were that 43,000 soldiers of Ukraine's armed forces were female. 5,000 of them were on the front line, to have some rough numbers how many women are actually serving in uniform inside of Ukraine. And the Flensburger Fahrzeugbau, which is one of the companies from Germany that modernizes and rebuilds Leopard 1 MBTs that were in storage, they are now opening a maintenance center in western Ukraine. Also, Ukraine is receiving UGVs, so unmanned ground vehicles, from the Czech Republic. We see that here they are capable of carrying, I think it was 300 kilos, according to this, 350. So ammunition, wounded, etc. And as they are electric powered, they are supposedly very quiet and have a low thermal signature, which should allow better supply of the units in Ukraine. And Ukraine is also receiving new underground steel shelters. Now, this is a very simple but effective concept. Basically, the steel that it's made of is not necessarily meant as armor. It's meant to hold back the dirt, as this is dug into the ground and then you fill the earth on top. And as you basically have a steel shell, you can put as much dirt as you realistically can on top without the soldiers being in danger of being crushed. And the deeper it is, the safer it is for the soldiers along the front line. And the systems inside, as you can see, they have some bunk beds, so you can rest here. This is very likely for an oven, so to allow for a chimney to heat it up in the dark. And we can see here how deep it can be dug to protect the Ukrainian soldiers from Russian attacks. And that was already it for me for now. If you like the situation report, please give it a thumbs up. It really helps with the algorithm. Leave a comment. What do you think about the current situation and the Western support for Ukraine? And if you're new here, I would like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss future videos. That's it from me for now. This channel is only possible because of the support of viewers like you. If you'd like to support the channel, you can do so by the means in the description. Thank you very much to everyone already supporting this channel. And as said, that's it from me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.